All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and sticking around for this. I hope I'll make it worth your while. I have been engaged in a project, I suppose, most of my life without really realizing what I was up to. So my peregrinations from my origins as a French historian and historian of the French colonial empire in the Arab world have led me in many different places. And in the process of that, I was always trying to figure out a way I could put those two halves of my intellectual existence together in one spot. And the obvious answer, it was even obvious to me then, but I couldn't figure out how to do it, was to think about the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean as an object of study in the modern sense of the term, as a scientific object, really begins with France and with the Expedition de l'Egypte, and more importantly perhaps subsequently with the Saint-Simonians, a French so-called utopian socialist group who had very big plans for the Mediterranean, the biggest of which I suppose we have to say was the Suez Canal. So they saw things in very big ways, and in the process, they helped to provide an intellectual grid for understanding how this classical space was going to be rebooted for modern times. So the story I want to tell is a story that goes in 3 acts, and it takes a while to unfurl. So I ask your patience for that. And it runs in terms of a series of 3, what I'm going to call sort of imaginary portals into particular worlds. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second. So, as a world historian, it's been my idea that it's necessary to stand back and look at the Mediterranean in very big ways if we want to understand Mediterranean modernity, or the kind of modernity that installs itself in the Mediterranean. And in order to do so, we need to be able to think at a larger level of abstraction than mostly has appeared in this room, which is the global level. Right, so with your indulgence, we'll do a little bit of that. You'll see it's not going to be too punishing, but I'll sort of give you a sense of just where we're headed as we move along. So the first thing is to recognize that we have no idea where we're going. There's lots of things going on. Some of them look pretty disastrous. Yesterday's events in Paris, foremost in our minds and our hearts, of course, always, particularly for Europeans, but I think for really everybody. This is just a huge amount to take on board. In many ways, it seems to me that really this and not the previous events that have happened post 9/11 in Europe, this is the real European 9/11, and so it's a you know, how do we understand it? I don't want to let that get in the path of the way I'm trying to think. There's a way in which being a world historian really forces you to try and stop being an ambulance chaser and explaining the latest crisis, because I think there are much bigger drivers for the events than the ones that we can see right in front of us right now, and where we might perhaps disagree in our diagnosis of how things got to be the way they are. But in some ways, those are but a regional manifestation of something that is much bigger and is really about humanity. So I suppose what I want to put forward today is captured in 2 sentences. One is that the Mediterranean is one space and not many. And that's even true in modern times. It may be a bit paradoxical, and you may disagree, but I think it's worth entertaining the idea. And the second thing is that the Mediterranean is the place where we can see profiled the future of humanity, and that particularly today might be a fairly distressing thought to have, but there are other things that we need to also think about and look at, and without having any sense of without having any sense of optimism and without overdosing the pessimism either, because we don't know. History is undetermined. I'm always reminded of the French futurologist writing in 1903 in Paris that based on current trends, that the future of communication inside the city of Paris is doomed, because we will be at least 1 meter deep in horseshit. The automobile was invented in 1904, and somehow that particular prediction didn't come to pass. So we need to be alert to the fact that there are things that could be sprung on us that we didn't see coming. The Internet revolution, perhaps for some of us in our own lives, might be an example of that, for good and ill. So anyway, without trying to predetermine the outcome, let's try and think about the Mediterranean, first of all, in an eco-historical perspective, and I mean a few specific things about that. And here are some of them. So I'm going to basically, in some fairly perhaps cryptic way, what I want to do is to think in a sort of a three-part, Mediterranean and 3 parts of modernity. One is the sort of the lead-in, which is typically refigured as the early modern, and then the other is the very long 19th century. I have some ideas about why we got some historians have chickened out and given us a 19th century that ends in 1919, or sometimes in 1914, and actually I think we ought to carry it on through to 1939, because in many respects the world of the interwar years is still the world of the 19th century. And so anyway, demographically, at a global level and at a Mediterranean level, I'm not prepared to cite figures on this just now, but I have done so in some of my writings. The world experiences a massive population increase that goes from something like 750 million. Primarily, these numbers are, these numbers are all suspect, but these numbers come from standard gazetteers that are widely used by historians and economists and others. So 750 million to 1.6 million around 1900 to, what is your favorite guess for what the population of the globe is right now? 7.2 billion, maybe a number. So there's this massive increase. And we have to see that against the background of all of human history that comes before, in which the Malthusian world is fully in evidence. And so if you look at the ancient world, going back as far as we have numbers and carry them on forward to about 1000 of the Common Era, you'll notice that population trends go up, they go down, they go up, they go down. So there's always a course correction, and this has everything to do with the second thing I want to mention, which is actually they're out of order, but is energy regimes. So by energy regimes, I mean where does human energy, where the energy that is at our disposition come from? And for most of human history until more or less 1750, we could say, many would want to push it still further along, we are in the world of solar energy regime. So everything basically on Earth comes in directly or indirectly from solar energy that is generated in the form of plants, which are then consumed by animals, which are then consumed by people, or maybe the people just eat the plants and they don't mess with the animals. But in any event, humans then are an important sort of system of portable energy storage units. So slavery is very much part of how that and why that is so important. But animal power, of course, is also important. Water power, and then other ways of generating energy for human use also come in. So these change over time, and it's my observation that each of the 3 sort of periods that I'm going to be looking at, so the early modern, so-called the long 19th century, and then the very short 20th century, which I start in 1950, each of them is associated with a change in energy regime. Each of them is associated with a change in climactic regime. So we're in the early modern period. We are still in what historians of world climate call the Little Ice Age, which we are in the process of finding more and more evidence for and more manifestations of, becoming more and more able to see how it impacted not just Northern Europe, where there are anecdotal evidences about the year that the Seine froze from one end to the other, or the year that we all could go skating on the Thames, or et cetera, but rather that in the larger way, the Mediterranean also has to confront the long-term global cooling that's part of a cyclical process that the planet has gone through many times, and which starts somewhere around the 9th, 10th century. Again, there's lots of disputes about when it begins and when it ends. Some say it goes all the way to 1840. Others think, no, that's way extreme. Let's drop it back into the 18th century. But clearly, things like the peasant wars provide part of the detonator of what will be the French Revolution, are in part climatically driven, right? And there are the 17th century crisis, which is well known to historians of modern Europe, seems to be in some ways a kind of a global pattern. It manifests itself in different ways in different times. Anyway, all of this is just to say that the Little Ice Age is an important component. There's a book by somebody named Farouk Tabak, which is called the Tabak, which is called The Waning of the Mediterranean, which provides a first cut kind of overview of how this plays itself out across the Mediterranean. There are other scholars who have also begun doing work on this subject about the Mediterranean and the Little Ice Age. So in general, the growing season is shorter. Rains are sometimes much more than one can contend with. So harvests are often bleaker, and famines are more perennial. A lot of the fertile areas along the coast of the Mediterranean become somewhat marshy and unfit for human habitation. They become sites of malaria. So there's ways in which, just thinking about the Mediterranean does not go through the Little Ice Age without consequence. Rather, more and more we're understanding subtly and even in more dramatic ways that it is also a big thing. The period of the so-called long 19th century, which I'm going to start in 1750 more or less and carry it on through, as I say, ultimately to 1950, is really shaped by the first phase of what we can now see, because it's where we are right now, the first phase of global warming, right? So global warming phase 1, which is a relatively beneficent phase, and leads to large-scale population increases, longer agricultural growing cycles, et cetera. So again, the Mediterranean is an important beneficiary of this. Populations of the Mediterranean, which had been slow to recover, and which were then retarded by the Little Ice Age and a combination of other factors that hit in the period after 1450, are able to recover, and population surges faster in some places than in others, to be sure. But so there's a general sort of population increase over the course of that period from 1750 to 1950, and it carries a lot on its shoulders, and it has consequences for some of the difficulties that people who are trying to reform states and economies run into, both beneficially and also negatively. Again, it's the sort of larger climatic envelope that helps to shape a context in which demographic increases can proceed faster. The energy regime question is still another one, often not really looked at in the context of the Mediterranean. But just as a for instance, and to check on if you're awake or not, let me just say that whereas whereas someone like Bernard Lewis would talk about what went wrong, and he would expect a one-word answer, and that answer is probably going to spring unbidden to many lips in this room: Islam. The one-word answer actually is quite inadequate, because one could give a different, more materialist kind of answer: no coal. Because there is functionally no coal in the Mediterranean during the period of the Industrial Revolution, in which coal is the principal, the first fossil fuel that is being put to use, and which is has very important consequences for the great economic distance that Northern Europe is able to put between itself and the Mediterranean. In this case, the Mediterranean somewhat prefigures the future of the Third World. And when I'm saying the Mediterranean, I mean the whole Mediterranean, and not just part of it. Yes, there is some coal in the Po Valley. Yes, there is some coal in Catalonia and in the Basque Country. Yes, eventually by the end of the 19th century, some coal is discovered in the Zolondok area in Anatolia. But these are not anthracite. This is bituminous coal. In fact, it's brown coal. It's the worst, most polluting, least energetically dense kind, and it is owned by foreign companies, right? So the whole thing, blizzard of things that get in the way. Doesn't mean that coal doesn't play a role in the Industrial Revolution in the Mediterranean. Of course it does, but it has to be imported at considerable expense, and it is an added burden that the economic transformation of the Mediterranean will then have to bear in the 19th century, and it's something that we need to bear in mind. Let me just run on to the next phase, which obviously you were going to anticipate already, which is fossil fuel phase 2, which is petroleum and natural gas. With petroleum and natural gas, it is true, were being used already by the early 20th century, particularly in the United States, where they come to be something like 30% of the total energy consumed. Much of the rest is coal. Wood is still a subsidiary source of energy, even in the United States by the end of the 19th century. Wood energy, of course, continues to be an important source of how you cook dinner all over the Mediterranean, in the absence of coal. And so there's things to think about there. I can't tarry with them. All I can do is go, whoops, here they are. And the final thing is the changing place of the Mediterranean in the topology of global exchange. What do I mean by that? Basically, what I mean by that is that previously the Mediterranean had been, or at least had seen itself as being the center of the economic world, a place where commodities were produced and from which they were exported to all around the world, into Africa, into Northern Europe, into the Middle East, and across down into Southeast Asia and South Asia, and so on. And starting in the 15th century, there is the emergence of a rival Mediterranean, a bigger and better Mediterranean, some people say, which is the Indian Ocean world, and it is into that world that Vasco da Gama will blunder at the end of the 15th century, right? So this is already underway before Europeans come around, and it is really driven by the Chinese economy primarily, which is the largest economy in the world at that point in time, something like 100 million Chinese around the end of the 15th century. Comparable figures for India, if you're interested in that. And China is the world's most advanced consumer society by quite a bit. And it has one small problem. If the Mediterranean has no coal, it has little or nothing in the way of monetary metals, right? And so, I'll leave the rest of that story and how the world economy comes about as we continue along. All right, you can look at this for a couple of seconds if you want. Primarily, all I'm trying to do here is to just begin to break down the types of globally driven change that are found all over the world and not just in Europe. So from a world historical perspective, some of you may or may not have encountered the notion that actually these kinds of changes that such as the fiscal military revolution that is so important in Western Europe starting in the 16th century, century are actually a global phenomenon. They're not something that is rooted merely in Europe, nor are they spread by the magic of Europe, but rather they are already installed in different societies around the globe. The pace of interaction certainly is hastened once Europeans come into the scene, particularly where the military revolution is concerned, because Europeans seem to take an inordinate delight in unleashing gunpowder weapons both on themselves and on others, right? So it becomes a kind of answer to many a problem, which only, of course, creates more problems, something that we are still in the process of learning what a dumb species we are. All right, so there's that. And then there's the economic parts, and the two key things are that it's from the point of view of world historians anyway, and I think there's a fair amount of documentation for this right now, certain resistance amongst older generations of economic historians, but the globalization of the world economy is centered on Asia, on India and China, but particularly on India, whose products are everywhere in demand, China and India, and that this is where the silver of the Americas come in. So this is a totally fortuitous thing. When Columbus goes across the Atlantic in his geographically challenged way, he thinks he's going to Japan. And he remains convinced to the end of his day that that's actually where he's been, or he's getting close to, but he hasn't quite arrived at. And then while he's back negotiating for further advances and additional fleets after the first one, the people he leaves behind discover that the Caribbean is filled with gold, and also there is signs that there is silver to be found. And then once Mexico and Peru are encountered by the early part of the 16th century, then suddenly it's silver bonanza, right? And the silver of the Americas then is what will drive the world economy. It's, for the first time, it unites a world economy, unites China to the rest of the world in ways that are crucially important to the development of the world economy. The fossil fuel revolution that comes toward the end of our first period it helps kick things into another gear, and we'll talk about that a little bit further along. All right, so here's some more things. The basic point here is just simply that the Mediterranean is one rather complicated and somewhat contradictory place. It's not multiple places. This is true not only at the sort of cultural level, this is also true in the larger eco-historical ways, and so, you know, Christianity, Judaism, Islam all have fatal encounters with Greek thought, with Hellenistic thought. They come out slightly differently in what they find problematic, but for each of them is a prophetic monotheistic tradition, and so Hellenistic thought contains some things that are deeply distressing and need to be thought through. Roman law spreads throughout the region. Roman law is actually part of the substrata from which the Sharia will emerge, right? So one more, somebody said the other day, was talking about the extent to which Islam is Western, and I would second that very strongly. And one reflection I would then give is that the Sharia, one of the things that most characterizes Islamic law, at least in the eyes of the media, the lens of Islam in the eyes of the media, actually is something that has sort of absorbed the heritage of Roman law. Okay, so and finally, the imperial tradition, I guess, is the other thing. So there's the urge for empire, the search for empire, and it goes all the way back to Babylonia and to Egypt, and roll the cameras forward. So the emergence of empire, the efforts to found empires that will bestride the Mediterranean, is something that becomes, is sort of constantly that little engine is sort of constantly cooking away, and it's the breakdown of that by the end of the 18th century that propels us into the modern world and into a world of nations and no longer a world of empires, although the truth of that assertion really will wait its proof until World War I, when the three great multi-ethnic empires at the eastern end of things, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman, will all go a-glimmering more or less in the same historical moment. All right, so that's the setup. So what I've just done is if we're performing a lab experiment, we've just sort of set up our table, and it took a little while to do, and I apologize for that, but this is the way these experiments work. I will try to be more efficient from here on in. Okay, now let's all pause, and let's look at this picture, and who knows what this picture is? Anybody? It's, I mean, if you can read, you can probably figure it out. Yeah, right. Right. So what I want to propose is that we use this as a kind of a door into a past, right? So this is the portal that will open for us the space, the historical space of the end of the 15th century and all that will unfold for the next several centuries, right? So it's pregnant with all sorts of things. It is a sort of accumulation of much that has come before. It also is fatally lacking some pieces, which I want to supply very quickly, but because it's not the only thing that's going on in the Mediterranean world, but I'm somebody who works on Morocco, so perhaps it's obvious I would go to that first, but it's also probably the most dramatic, and because it involves the Spanish, and the Spanish will quickly, if to their own amazement, stumble into all the riches of the Americas, it is historically consequential in ways that are really still quite surprising. Okay, so these are some of the topics I want to try and touch on in the next 5 or 7 minutes. And so the Reconquista is a process of sort of cultural tectonic grinding that has been going on for a while, if you'll permit me that metaphor. I come from earthquake land, so if you're from the Mediterranean, you do too. And perhaps you can understand where I'm coming from with this, but the Reconquista takes centuries, right? So this is the accumulation. In some ways, we could say what just went on in Paris, it's still going on, guys. It ain't over yet, right? So there's some kind of cultural grinding that is happening at this deeper historical level that is characteristic of the split, but also somehow intimately and intricately interconnectedness of Mediterranean peoples, right? So there's that both of those things are true, and that's part of the paradox and the wonder and the delight of studying the Mediterranean. The Reconquista is also, as we'll see, an export product. And therein hangs a tale or two, which I can't tell. I want to talk about how we, with 1492 and the Columbian voyage, and more importantly, in some ways, historically, I think, the Vasco da Gamian, if that's a word, voyage, that we find ourselves projected into a Mediterranean that is now a global Mediterranean and no longer the inner sea of the Romans, right? So where the Mediterranean enters a new space, ultimately one that will prove disappointing because as the Atlantic world emerges as a new space of cultural contact and particularly economic exchange, it will quickly make the Mediterranean seem like small potatoes, right? So the Mediterranean is sort of we're back to the topology of world exchange, right? So the Mediterranean, and it's not just the Indian Ocean world, but now it's the Atlantic world that helps to put the Mediterranean in a new, less favorable position in terms of its ability to operate in the emergent world economy. And then finally, I have some remarks on did the Mediterranean decline or did the West rise, which is perhaps reveals the old Marxist that still lurks within me. So, in any event, the Reconquista in the 16th century World War. So, not everybody's persuaded there was one. I have to say that first of all. But Andrew Hess, who is an historian of the Ottoman Empire, wrote a series of very important essays and a book which argued that there was something called the that there was something to be called a 16th century world war, because in fact the Ottomans responded to what the Iberians were doing, and they didn't just respond in the Balkans and in the Middle Eastern end of things, but they actually built armadas of galleys and sent them as far away as Sumatra, right? So all the way around India to support Sunni Muslim allies of theirs. So we have prefigured in the 16th century World War, we have prefigured many of the alliance structures in some ways that have come back to the surface with the end of the Cold War, I would submit, right? So it's very intriguing to sort of contemplate. There's the clear contrast between the ethnic cleansing approach of the Reconquista and the conciliation approach of the Ottoman Empire, which we heard some about this morning and earlier yesterday. The wars of religion in the Mediterranean, and here this is a sort of cryptic reference perhaps, but needs to be unpacked for a second, has to do partly with the wars of religion that are going on between Christianity and Protestantism, or the different branches of Christianity, perhaps we should say, of the Western sort. There remains the Orthodox branch, right? If we want to divvy up the Mediterranean by religion, we can say there's an Orthodox, there's a Catholic, and there's a Sunni Muslim Mediterranean, right? Not a Shiite one. And the Orthodox one mostly is left out, and I'm going to probably do that too. But the wars of religion are also in some ways fought between Islam and Christianity, and that's the continuation of the Reconquista, and that continues to happen on up into the latter part of the 16th century. So we're back to the tectonic plates model. So there's a lot of instability. The ground is moving beneath our feet at the western end of the Mediterranean. And one other element of that, this is the chance for Morocco to shine in world historical terms. The Battle of the Three Kings, as it's called, is the most important battle that nobody knows about. It was world historical in its impacts, particularly on Portugal. If you know a little bit about it, it's a battle that was fought in the 16th century between the Portuguese and several different Moroccan kings from different dynasties, because Morocco was pretty much up for grabs in that period. And Don Sebastian, who is the heir to the Portuguese throne, puts together the most massive sort of invasion force that the Portuguese have been able to muster up until that time. Most of the sort of the financial credit of Portugal is sort of hangs in the balance of a successful encounter, and instead of which it's a fiasco. Don Sebastian himself is killed. That kicks off the scrum that goes on as the Castilians begin to figure out how they might acquire this property that has now come loose, because it no longer has there is no heir after Don Sebastian is the key thing. And so for a 60-year period, Portugal becomes part of Greater Iberia Incorporated, and so that more or less ends Portugal's efforts in Morocco. It is an economic catastrophe for all those people who invested in a good outcome for this, and doesn't help the Portuguese, therefore, in any respect. And finally, it really decisively cleans the political board in Morocco and leads to the rise of the Saadian dynasty, who will solidify Moroccan frontiers, keep the Iberians at bay, launch an expedition into Timbuktu, into the heart of Africa, to the sources of the gold of the famous golden trade of the Moors that went across the Sahara, and which also will enable the Moroccans to keep the Ottomans from taking over Morocco, because at this point the Ottomans are very much on the move in North Africa, starting in 1517, and they are unable to take Morocco Morocco, and that also has some important consequences. So, the Saadians, just one more word about them, are what I would call a gunpowder empire, right? So this is a fiscal military state of the kind that emerges elsewhere, and it is surprisingly adept both at manufacturing its own arms and also acquiring the wherewithal to purchase arms from willing sellers elsewhere, and is able to then use that for a period. And so, anyway, that's that story. But the more important part of our grinding of cultural plates has to do with Constantinople, which happens actually before 1492. It happens in 1453, and some of you who are eager to raise the Ottoman flag, if we could just figure out what it looked like, would be quick to tell me that. So if 1453, there's an important but little-known article by the late Charles Issawi, which talks about the Balkan Anatolian sort of cultural frontier and the Ibero-Maghrebi cultural frontier. And these are two spaces where this cultural grinding is going on, in particular at the end of, in the 15th century in a very intense way. And it leads to the Ottoman takeover of much of the Balkans on the one hand, and it leads to the victory of the Spanish and Portuguese in Iberia and the dual ethnic cleansing of Muslims and Jews. So the contrasting strategies of the Iberians and of the Ottomans are of note and of interest for this period, and allow the Ottomans to be able to incorporate and acquire the willing energies of the Greeks and Armenians and other peoples of the Balkans who choose to accept Ottoman rule. Not everybody does, needless to say. Some of those people who don't would deny that there were ever any Hungarians who ever did, and so on. But in fact, that's not the case. All right, so here's the extent of the Ottoman Empire, just to remind us. So it goes all the way to the frontiers of Morocco in Africa. It goes down the Red Sea, it goes down the Persian Gulf, and it goes around the Black Sea. Some of those blue areas are allies of the Ottomans. So the Ottoman Empire is, as we say, no chop liver, right? It's an important contender and an interestingly placed rival of the Iberians, and has been able, in the course of the 16th century World War, to project its power as far away as India. All right, so I'm bouncing along here. So the inner sea to the World Sea, you can read that. I don't probably want to add too much to that. It's just it's so important that in the larger context of humanity, that there was this moment when the world economy came together, and and it was totally and necessarily dependent upon the arrival of the silver of the Americas. So the Americas now become not necessarily the Americans, the indigenous peoples, not necessarily willingly, become accomplices in the creation of this world economic zone of exchange. Here's the pre-existing game board of exchange. All these little black lines are caravan routes, and they're also sailing routes. And so you can see that if we want to get strict constructionist about the Mediterranean, as Horton and Purcell, authors of The Corrupting Sea, that was mentioned yesterday, which is an important book that mostly hasn't been in our discussions here, might be worth a look for some people. Before they want us to have they're kind of strict constructionist, narrow med kind of people, I would go even beyond Brodel, and I would think that you have to think about the Mediterranean as being a space that has multiple different sort of valences. It has wings that are, as they used to say, of variable geometry, so that they can change their pitch as they encounter different speeds and different altitudes. And so in this sense, the Mediterranean goes into the heart of Africa, connected by these webs of trade. It goes all the way to China via the land routes. Subsequently, it will go all the way to China via the largely Islamically dominated sail routes. That's already starting to happen before Vasco da Gama is anywhere. The planting of Islam in Indonesia predates the coming of the Portuguese, and it involves Chinese Muslims as well as Muslims coming from South Asia coming together in the foundation of Islam in Indonesia. So it's a very interesting sort of historical moment. Don't have time to say more about that. The military revolution we know about because it leads to the creation of modern states. It leads to the decline of the old princely and feudal order, and it's based on the basic premise that if you can afford gunpowder weapons, you can stay in the game, and if you can't afford gunpowder weapons, then you better just collect your marbles and go home, because you're not going to be able to stay in the game. So lots of smaller political entities are pushed off the game board at this point, and larger, more powerful states emerge. The most powerful in the 17th century is that of Louis XIV. It's important so the French come up with a partial solution to how to fund gunpowder weapons, which has to do with the application of sort of reason to the tax code, and realizing that the tax code includes large numbers of sleeping giants who are not paying their fair share, including the aristocracy and the clergy, particularly the higher clergy, and the beginnings of a sort of a modern fiscal system are sort of based here, and if you, in some ways, I want to call it the fiscal military revolution. A lot of historians will do it in reverse, because it's not that I love bankers, and it's not that I love tax collectors, but it is the case that really it's about, if you don't have the ability to pay for it, you can have all the will in the world, but you cannot have that howitzer. I'm sorry. Right? So that's the way it works. And so the military fiscal revolution is something that we already see in action in Iberia. I don't have time to go into that. I have a forthcoming piece that works on that subject. All right, so what the fiscal military revolution does in some ways is it sets up a kind of a struggle that will go on in the course of the 19th century. It's already starting to go on by the end of the 18th century within the Habsburg Empire and its various different appendages, and also within the Ottoman Empire, over how can we adopt these things, and in particular, can we get the religious groups who benefit from tax exemptions. In the case of Muslims, it's the so-called Waqf revenues, WAQF, if you're encountering this for the first time. So these are foundation properties that are donated by pious individuals for particular pious purposes, and the revenues of those are devoted to that, and it's off the tax register, right? And so it's a way, it operates sort of like American foundations. It's a way of putting rich families putting wealth aside without it being able to be gotten at by the tax collector. Will the military also then be forced to, the military elites, that is to say the feudal elites, will they also be forced to participate in their fair share? That becomes also a subject of debate. All right, so we find ourselves by the end of the period in this moment in which the emergence of these agrarian empires is now in the process of being transformed because of the demographic pressures, the climatic pressures, the other ones, the sort of larger order ones that are outside of the control of humans, as well as these ones that are coming from very much in the control of humans, such as the fiscal military revolution. 16th century World War, just note the map, so it takes you all the way to Sumatra and other places besides, and this is primarily the Iberians who are prosecuting this war, and they are looking for Islam and Muslims everywhere they go. When Vasco da Gama gets to Calicut, famously, one of the things he does is he looks for Muslims. He's not eager to have anything to do with them. He, in fact, would be delighted to run them through, but he fatally misunderstands what he's seeing as he's invited to a Hindu ceremony, he thinks he's actually in a Catholic church, only they're not doing it quite right, but it's actually a Hindu one, and so much hangs on this misunderstanding. When the Spanish go to the Mediterranean, similarly, they bring all of the sort of Reconquista apparatus, including the apparatus for taking the land of the locals and for putting a lien on the labor power of the locals, and so on and so on. So the Reconquista is a whole machine of conquest that establishes institutions and structures that are very difficult to remove. Empires continue to have at with more or less energy, more or less success. As we get into the 17th century, when there is this famous crisis, it becomes rather more difficult, as Molly was telling us this morning, for both the Ottomans and for the Spanish to be able to maintain control of their respective parts of the Mediterranean, and that allows the flourishing of pirates of all kinds, which is, of course, the kind of thing that students will immediately flock to your course if they discover you're talking about pirates. All right. So then there's the sort of preliminary judgment up to 1750, so what's going on in the Mediterranean economically? In some respects, the Mediterranean is holding its own. We have pretty good documentation from a bunch of different historians, among them André Raymond, who have looked in detail at what the earnings are for merchants that are involved in the so-called spice trade and the larger Asian trade coming up the Red Sea, and they actually maintain more or less the same level that they were at before in terms of the value. It's just that the pie has gotten so much bigger, right? So that now the spice trade is not just something that comes to the Mediterranean via the Red Sea and the lands of Islam, but now it's something that comes around Africa, and more so as different European contenders also then begin to become involved. So this multipolar Asian-centered world economy is already in the process of being transformed. However, the basic problem for Europeans is that Asians are not particularly interested in acquiring European goods, which they see as basically shoddy and not anything up to the level of what they're used to. The only thing that Europeans can produce that they seem to like are guns, hello, echoes of today, and so until Europeans solve this problem and can figure out in particular how to crack the code of getting into the China market, this sort of basic shortcoming of the world economy as then operating would continue. All right, here we are, new portal, and now we are at the Battle of the Pyramids. This is 1798. Napoleon is in Egypt. It's not a walkover, folks. Actually, there's a lot of resistance that went on for quite a long time, and Napoleon was lucky to have actually had Napoleon sink his ship so that he could then go back. Why the British did this, I don't know. The British then take him back to France. You know the story, right? So the man that will soon become the terror of nations, right, is sort of just an up-and-coming French general, and he's gotten himself marooned in Egypt, and so they take him back, possibly thinking that they're going to just foment further squabbling amongst the generals, but that doesn't work out that way, does it? Okay, so anyway, for the Middle East, for the Ottoman Empire, this is the knocking on the door of something that will be a fantastic challenge for the next 200 years, or well, 150 years, let's just say. That will go right by. All right, so once again, we have these demographic factors. Let's go flying past them. There is a communications revolution I wanted to briefly reference because it is important, particularly in the 19th century, as some of the new inventions begin to be developed, and it's not just new methods of navigation, sail navigation, sailing technology, but by the middle of the century, now we're in a moment when steam navigation becomes important, and that's very key for the Mediterranean, and it's part of what helps to drive the financial decisions to fund the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal becomes a viable investment because there is now increasing sort of momentum in the direction of steam transport, and that will shorten the distance in very dramatic ways between the Mediterranean, Europe on the one hand, and Asia on the other. But there's also railroads and a whole host of other things which you can read about, and I will struggle on by. The reform does not happen quickly. In some ways, it doesn't happen at all for some places, or there's a way in which things keep getting stuck and unstuck. Spain is a particularly good example. It's not the only example. And it has to do, in part, with the Reform Party and the Anti-Reform Party, which then shape up pretty much as the sort of the clergy and its allies on the one hand, and the reformers on the other, who increasingly are taking a dim view of religion because it, A, is controlling all this untaxed revenue in the form of monastery and church lands, and on the other hand, it is also controlling the minds of the people such that they cannot receive the enlightenment that is coming to them. All right, so anyway, that's a story that we all know. What I did want to dwell on for a little bit in the 19th century, and I don't think it's just because I'm a French historian, but is that there is a kind of a toolbox that gets generated for political reform in the 19th century that goes all over the Mediterranean, and that is worth taking a minute or two to think about today, perhaps, which and it proves wildly attractive, and sometimes the attractiveness is something that some are slower to pick up on than others, but it includes the notion of there being a constitutional republic, so look out kings, right? So the French rather drastic solution of the monarchy problem is one that some wish to emulate, and there are strong republicans even in places that remain monarchist for some period. Hello Italy, hello Spain, and hello Portugal. So military modernization is certainly the center of this, and it's how to fund it. So it's the modern tax system, modern administrative system, bureaucracy, and once we say that, then we can start talking about the École Polytechnique, engineering in the service of the state, internal communications reforms that the state then gets behind and pushes, the role of the state in education, and the setting up the struggle that will go on in France and elsewhere in Latin Europe, but also to some extent in the Muslim parts of the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire especially, the struggle between the clergy and the local schoolmaster, and sort of this sort of church-state thing begins to happen in somewhat different forms in the Muslim sections than others. Legal reforms are introduced, and so the entire Mediterranean, and not just part of it, comes under versions of Napoleonic Code. So the legal restructuring that goes on under the Tanzimat, for instance, is largely the importation of the Code Napoleon, in its Belgian form. Somehow the Belgian form was regarded as somewhat more importable because Belgium is a monarchy, yet it was pleased to accept, sometimes at the point of a gun, the coming of French reform. All right, so the new powers that the state has then makes state bureaucrats of this cast of mind think of how they can transform their societies. It also, of course, whips up the fury of those who are opposed to these changes and kicks the church-state thing into another gear where that conflict has been established. So it's not a walkover. The legacy of the French Revolution is a rather mixed one in the end, and in part because the French reforms are imposed at the point of a bayonet around the Mediterranean in some places and not in others. And so one of the questions that my particular approach, I think, makes it possible to ask is, how much does it matter that the French reforms are installed at the point of a gun, at the point of a bayonet, versus freely accepted and adopted by local rulers, right? And there's not an easy answer to that question, but I would point out that it is at the point of a bayonet that Italy and Spain accept Napoleonic code law and the French reforms, right? And it is at the free will of the Ottoman Sultan that the Tanzimat reforms are engaged in the 19th century, which are largely an importation of the whole reform package to the Ottoman Empire. Similar for somewhat earlier in the case of Egypt under Muhammad Ali. So there's no warrant for saying that the Muslim parts of the Mediterranean miss out on these reforms. And indeed, the elites, particularly the governmental and administrative elites, but to some extent also the economic elites around the Mediterranean all speak French. And by the end of the 19th century, they are all taking the waters and going to the opera together in various famous places that one does these things, and going to the gambling houses and so on. So there's a way in which, so if you look at a distance stop action photo about 1890 or so at the elite level, what you see is a modern elite. They speak local languages, but they also speak French. French is their language into modernity, and that's true all the way across the area. It's also the case, and let me just pause for a moment while I change slides, to say that at the level of worker protest, similar things are going on. So workers all over the Mediterranean, not in just in some parts of it, are actively engaged in trying to resist the changes that are being imposed from above. And the language of protest that they use is the language of anarcho-syndicalism. Right? Anarcho-syndicalism is of course the language of protest in Italy, famously, but also in Spain, perhaps even more famously. Lies at the roots of what becomes the Spanish Civil War in the 20th century. But it is also the language of protest of the workers that are working on the railroads and the ports and the cotton and other plantations in Egypt, and where foreign capital also plays an important role. And there is the emergence of an Egyptian capitalist class, and of an Ottoman capitalist class who have some problematic features, but then who doesn't? And we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so the Tanzimat, I don't want to go into, but I think I probably did enough on this. Here we are back to the big picture. Was there a Mediterranean Industrial Revolution? Did the Mediterranean miss out on an Industrial Revolution? And so unless you're following the probably mostly article-driven literature, in the 1990s, there were a group of Spanish, French, Italian, and some Greek economic historians who argued that there was a Mediterranean route to development. And it had specific characteristics because, of course, large deposits of coal and iron are not to be found in the Mediterranean. So it had it operated in other areas, particularly in food processing, textiles, metallurgy, shipbuilding are some of these areas, and particularly high-end textiles. So think silk, for example, don't think wool. But tempered by the fact that all the coal that was being used in the factories and so on had to be imported. Right, so with that qualification, there is a Mediterranean Industrial Revolution, and it looks differently from the steam and metallurgy revolution that happens in Northern Europe for reasons that are perfectly easy to see, which is that Mother Nature had not favored the Mediterranean with those particular resources, and so they had to make do with what they had, and they did. And so there is a sort of Mediterranean economic modernity in the 19th century, I'd argue, and it takes these forms. For the Ottoman territories, Muslim territories perhaps more generally, there's a problem, and that things can't operate in quite the same way because of something that gets called in the historical literature the unequal treaties. Actually, that historical literature that I'm referencing there is the historical literature on China. But it's the same thing, basically. So the Europeans impose a series of onerous treaties that require that the locals have very high duties on exports and low duties on imports. That seems paradoxical. Why would they even want to accept that? power has a lot to do with why they are compelled to accept it. There's also, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, this thing called the capitulatory system, which a series of treaties signed back in the 18th century, seemingly innocently, by the Ottoman Empire, lead to a situation in which not only Europeans, but who have signed these treaties, and their employees, but also their business agents and even their local indigenous business agents are exempt from taxes. Right, that's one thing. Have access to European-style credit markets as opposed to the local money lender. Exempt from local legal obligations. So when the Ottomans introduced the draft, anybody who has a connection to somebody with the capitulatory papers doesn't have to go, right? And who are these people? Mostly they're Christian, right? So that creates a divide, and it's part of the old way in which Europeans had been used to dealing with the Mediterranean, which is what works through the Christians. And so there's an historical precedent for how this came about. But it's that, and then it's the politics of debt. Here we are back in looking at Greece again, right? And this is the same old as far as the Mediterranean is concerned. The politics of debt then is always set up in such a fashion that when you read the fine print, you would never sign it, because, but in fact, you're compelled to sign it, and it looks attractive at the time. So the British, well, the French in particular, imposed this massive debt on the Egyptians for the construction of the Suez Canal, and then, of course, they go bankrupt and they can't pay, and the gunboats are sent in, and that leads to the British landing troops in 1882, and eventually to the British takeover. Right. So this is a serious problem. Gunboat diplomacy is also an element in this. The Mediterranean region is not without revolutions. It's just that they don't work out too well. So there's the Young Turk Revolution, there's a constitutional revolution in Persia, and there's a constitutional revolution in Morocco, less said about which the better, because it's mostly concocted by a bunch of guys who are sitting in a cafe, and they don't really have much access to power. All right, so larger 19th century summary, you can read what's there, but there's this larger context, and migration is a huge theme. I haven't had a chance to talk about that. There are ways in which doing things this way allow you to look across the board and see the commonalities of migration, for example, and commonalities also of the struggle of women for access to the public spare, which is again a prominent Mediterranean theme everywhere, and which I can't talk about. Third image, and tell me somebody how many minutes you were willing to put up with. What do you think? All right, so this one is particularly delicious in light of current events, and it's FDR and Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the great patriarch who produced many hundreds of children from many dozens of wives, sitting together on a boat in the Great Bitter Lake. I'll show you where that is in a minute, and with right nearby, the local CIA man, who is also an Arabist and is able to translate, and who also has the ear of Ibn Saud, right, and is therefore also in the employ of Aramco, and just to make sure all the bases are covered, he's also an academic. Right. So what happens on this boat really prefigures in some ways the future. It's all about oil. It's all about how the Americans enter into the Mediterranean regime. It's all about privileging the Saudis in particular, not disrupting them, turning them into some kind of, the Saudi state into some kind of Indian reservation in a very large way, in which they get to keep their customs and so on, and nobody will mess with them, in return for which they have to supply their oil at reasonable prices, right? And so that's a bargain that, as it turns out, looks increasingly dubious as we get deeper and deeper into the chronological time and find ourselves in the aftermath of what just went on in Paris. There's the Great Bitter Lake. Okay, that's the big blob in the middle of the Suez Canal. All right, so this is right, if you're keeping score, this is right after Yalta. So after that set to, which came out, according to, was evaluated differently by different of the participants, FDR, already at the process of dying, right, is brought to the Great Bitter Lake on an American naval vessel to meet with Ibn Saud. And this has been carefully choreographed. It also is perhaps worth noting that at this point, petroleum is not a major commodity in the world market. Yes, it's true that the British Navy has switched some few years earlier to petroleum from coal, and a couple of other navies are in the process of doing that. But by and large, petroleum is not widely used. The most common fossil fuel used in industrial in industrial parks and so on is coal still, right? And so Saudi Arabian oil was discovered in 1933 or so, and it's kept in the ground, right? And partly it's kept in the ground not to tempt those who shouldn't be tempted, but in particular the Nazis, but also partly they hadn't figured out what to do with the addition of Arabian oil. They didn't to the world market. The Americans were in the process of trying to figure out how they could run an end run around the British, who were the dominant players at that point. And also the pipeline technology that was necessary had not been invented, right? So that they sort of had this stuff in the ground, but they couldn't quite get it anywhere as of that point. So lo and behold, oil then becomes the magic substance of our lifetimes, for sure, right? And it's in the process of, Marshall Plan Aid is conditional on switching from coal to oil. The switching from coal to oil has a further useful economic benefit at a moment when the United States is very sort of nervous about the role of organized workers, particularly coal workers, who happen to be in most European countries stoutly communist, right? So as we gradually de-emphasize coal and emphasize oil, it means that you're gradually defunding the left, particularly the communists on the left, and that has some very important consequences for how things play out in the EU and up until today. Okay, so Wahhabi Islam then has a sort of permanent funding stream. Wahhabi Islam being the kind of Islam that is invented and flourishes in Saudi Arabia, and Wahhabi Islam becomes a product a cultural product that can then be sent around the Arab world to counter those pesky people, the progressive Arab nationalists such as Nasser, and such as the various others who rule countries like Syria and Iraq, and not to speak of Algeria, and so on. So, funding Wahhabi Islam helps to fund the Muslim Brotherhood in time one, so that the Saudis are impressed by them and have an alliance with them, which lasts until 9/11, and then they decide they're going to go on their own, and here's where we are now. Okay, so these are just some numbers on world population. This one, and that one is world fossil fuel consumption. Here's some numbers that have been generated by somebody. I stole this table from somebody, and I don't know actually who it was, which puts me in an awkward position. But what is the share of world gross domestic product, how it changes between 1870 and 1998. And for some key players, Africa, of course, is a very large space. Maybe we could discount that. But it's just interesting to see, particularly, look what happens to India and China in 1870, and then look at where they are in 1998, right? And so it's a defunding, or the sort of radical sort of foot on the brake of their ability to continue to expand gross domestic product in their own countries, right, is part of the legacy of colonialism, and so argues the person who assembled this table. I'm going to go past this. I didn't talk about colonialism. I can't talk about colonialism. I have 3 minutes left. So there's that, right? And so here we all are. On the road to who knows where. Some of these things were mentioned before, earlier this morning in particular, toward the end of that session. The final one I think that really we need to think about is when the world economy is transformed in the 1970s. So the end of Bretton Woods, the end of the U.S. dollar being the almighty dollar, and putting us in this glide path to where is the U.S. dollar going to be, the rise of the renminbi, the rise of other potential currencies. So there's a whole sort of economic sovereignty thing that is very important. Finally, there's global warming, right? So as if things weren't bad enough, right? And this is going to directly impact the Mediterranean. Anybody who has been in the Mediterranean locally, recently, knows that it gets, up into 40 degrees centigrade and more, right? And this will be more like 45 in some parts of the Middle East, and that will be sort of more or less permanent. So in other words, unless you are an Arab sheikh and have access to unheard of amounts of money and therefore can afford to pay your air conditioning bill, you're really doomed, right? So, and then there's so global warming is one. This is that same table I had before projected in terms of people versus economy. So which brings me back to the Mediterranean at the end, and we're not going to call it the Mediterranean the cause of humanity. This is sort of the place where we have to sort of say, okay, fine. So can we actually do something? And the answer is, I think we can, but we have to be very careful in doing so. I can't say what we can do now, but some of you have ideas. But we are in a situation which is not unlike that back in 1450, 1500. We have broken political institutions in which democracy not only doesn't work in the Middle East, it doesn't work anywhere, where corruption abounds and where the 1% are busy trying to feather their nests and sell arms to the Wahhabis. That's a really smart idea. I really think that ought to continue. It's definitely in the future of humanity's interest to have that go on. And foolish efforts are made, and there's some of the fools. Thank you.